Pre-World War II, everything was imperial. And if you had iron ore and steel and food and coal, you could try to make something of yourself. And if you weren't, you were probably a colony. But with globalization post-1945, you now only needed one of those things, and you could trade for the others. And the whole world started to industrialize and urbanize. As we urbanized, we moved into the cities, and people started taking manufacturing jobs, and that generated growth and specialization in education and health and all the other things that we associate with the modern world. But when you're on a farm, you have lots of kids because they're free labor. You move into the city, you have like 1.2. And so we have been in a stage of ever accelerating population crashes now in parts of the world for 75 years. In the post-Cold War environment, when the end of history happened, everything about globalization and the Cold War kicked into high gear, and the countries that had not embraced it yet did. And most of the economic growth we have experienced globally since 1990 has been about metabolizing assets and countries and populations and resources that were not involved before 1990. And that is roughly half of the world. And this is the story of the Brazilian agricultural explosion, or the Russian commodities explosion, or the Chinese manufacturing explosion. But it was all happening against the backdrop of that demographic collapse. When you stop having kids, at first you generate a lot of growth. Because if you're in your 20s and your 30s and you have no kids, you're not spending money on diapers and school. You're spending it on cars and condos. It's a lot more high octane. And you get the growth story we've seen in the developing world, especially in China. But when you then are in your 50s, where they are now, the growth stops because you've got everything that you need. And when you retire, it all stops completely. So what we're seeing now in the 2020s is a lot of the world has aged into this point where the growth story is over and the production story is over, and there isn't a story moving forward. So we've had 35 years roughly of the greatest economic growth in the most open system in the world, but it was never more than a geopolitical and a demographic moment in time. And this decade, it was always going to end. And it can be sped up, and we're seeing that now. COVID sped it up. The Ukraine war is speeding it up. The complete descent of China into narcissistic cult of personality, not narcissism, is speeding it up. And we are looking at the end of the world that we understand in probably the next 36 months.
I see. So speeding up the end of globalization. Wow. It sounds, the title of the book, this doesn't sound good for business.
Yeah, it depends upon who you are. Not all countries are created equal. Not all demographics are structured the same. So if you're in a position where today's 50-somethings actually had kids, so there's a replacement generation, you're not having a consumption crisis. If anything, you might be having inflation because of consumption. And that's what we're seeing here in the United States. If you are on a chunk of geography where you're physically secure, then if global trade breaks down, you really don't have a problem. And so for the United States, only 12% of GDP is involved in international trade, but half of that is in NAFTA. Whereas for the Chinese, the number is closer to 40%. And that includes the mass import of the energy they need to keep the lights on and the food they need to keep the population alive. So, obviously you interfere with international trade and China ceases to exist as an entity. So there will definitely be relative winners and relative losers. But if you are a firm that is involved in international trade, there's not a lot about this that looks great, unless, of course, your footprint is in Mexico, in which case, hot damn, you're probably in the best spot in the world.
Right. I found your discussion in this regard of Russia-Ukraine versus China-Taiwan to be really interesting. Russia being a producer of food and fuel, basically was your point, versus China being the biggest importer of these things. And I tell you, it's everybody you meet, it seems like in the financial world, like China's, they still view it as a great power.
Yeah.
And that's not the message I'm getting from you. The message I'm getting from you is, she is this kind of Cold War type of guy who wants to really buckle down and bear down on his own economy. And right at this moment, we're seeing him get a lot of, it's like 1990 all over again in Tiananmen Square, it seems like.
Just on a much larger scale.
Much larger scale now. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's difficult to overstate just how screwed China is. If you back up to before COVID, they were the most exposed country in the world in terms of energy and food security. They get their stuff from at least a half a continent away, typically more than a continent away, and they are utterly dependent upon the U.S. Navy to keep the trade lanes open in order to access some of those materials. And then they're utterly dependent upon the Americans keeping their market open to sell their end product to. So every stage of the Chinese economic model is dependent not simply on American quiescence, but America actually empowering the Chinese system to succeed. And between the kind of disconnected populism of Trump and the more active nationalism, the kind of disconnected populism of Obama, the more active nationalism of Trump, and now the bureaucratic economic populism of Biden, every piece of the support network that keeps China going is being challenged at the same time. At the same time that the Biden administration has killed their tech sector. At the same time that they've become completely dependent on Russian energy, which, whether it's coming from the west or the east, is at its peak and can only go down from here because the technical workers that are necessary to keep it going are no longer there. At the same time, their demographics have collapsed, with even the Chinese now admitting that they overcounted their population by 100 million people aged 40 and under, at the same time that Xi has completely destroyed all information reporting within the country in order to further his cult of personality. So we are on the verge of a catastrophic, spectacular Chinese collapse.
The screen froze up when you said collapse.
Oh, that's good. That was the last word.
I know how that word ends. Wow. So, I mean, is China uninvestable, or what
I would argue at this point that any money that is in China is already lost. If you own a fixed asset there, your best chance is that the Chinese are going to confiscate it, but let your managers go.
Right. I saw you discussing this, and you said, well, we're past the point where you're going to do anything with the assets. You better get your people out. In other words, you better have a plan to get your people out, or they could be stuck there.
Yeah. With the protest that started Thanksgiving week in the United States, there was really only two paths here. I mean, number one is in a cult of personality system where all policies start with one person. When you protest a policy, you're protesting the leader. And we saw the protests evolve in that direction in a matter of days, with people directly challenging the competence of their dear leader. If that is allowed to spin out of control, that tears the entire system down. And China has collapsed a number of times in the past because of that sort of popular uprising. Or we get a nationwide Tiananmen-style crackdown for political reasons. Neither of these outcomes is good for investment or manufacturing. And if it's the second one, anyone with a foreign link is going to be immediately seen as a security threat, and they will be treated appropriately.
Oh, so your folks can wind up not merely stuck in China, but stuck in a prison in China.
And again, China's history suggests that this has happened many times before as well.
Wow. This just, I'm going to leave that alone, because I do want to get back to the point. I do want to talk a little bit, or hear you talk a little bit, about Ukraine and Russia. What I loved about what you did was you gave me an answer, a concrete answer to this question that is everywhere, which is,
what the hell are the Russians thinking?
Turn out? Yeah, well, what the hell are the Russians thinking? But specifically the question that's been in the media and just on everyone's like, when does it end? How does it end? Who wins and when? And you didn't exactly tell me that, but you gave me a pretty darn concrete moment in time. I wonder if you would go over that for me.
Yeah, sure. So when the war began, the Ukrainians had been preparing for 8 years, but preparing with very limited resources. And they had a problem with the Americans under Trump, because Trump had stopped all military assistance to Ukraine. If you remember back to the impeachment hearings, it was Trump's ability to blackmail Zelensky. That's where it all started. And so when Biden came in, he started the aid back up. And when the javelins started reaching the front line around last Thanksgiving, roughly, that is when the Russians decided, okay, we need to move, and the troop buildup started. But for the first 6 months of the war, the Ukrainians were hanging on by the skin of their teeth. They were completely dependent upon foreign tech and foreign equipment to make things run. The change in the math occurred in August and September with the Kharkiv offensive. And in 36 hours, the Ukrainians captured the city of Izium, which had been the Russian primary forward staging base. And they captured it intact. And in that 36-hour period, the Ukrainians captured more Russian tanks and artillery than they began the war with. More tanks and artillery than NATO had transferred to them in the war to that point. And then the Battle of Kherson happened a few weeks after that, and they got a haul that was nearly as large. So they're going to need the winter to do a lot of deferred maintenance and get this Russian stuff back into operation. And you add that to the 60-odd thousand Ukrainian troops that are training abroad on new weapon systems that are not yet in theater, and just the general advancement of the military quality back home. And by the time we get to the end of mud season in May, it's going to be a very different military on the Ukrainian site. We're not probably going to see a huge amount of maneuvering in mud season. So you can kind of split the conflict period into 4 periods in a year in Ukraine. You've got the hard winter when everything's frozen, where you can maneuver fine. You've got the summer when you can maneuver and everything is fine. But on the shoulders in the spring and the fall, when it's cold but not cold enough to freeze the ground, you get this thick mud in the steppe, and then you really can't operate with tanks. We get to the other side of mud season. The Ukrainians are going to have a couple 100,000 men operating equipment more advanced than they've ever had. And it's going to be a very different sort of army. On the Russian side, there's going to be at least 500,000 new men on the front lines, perhaps as many as 1 million. And by the time we get to the end of June, we're going to know whether this is a Sparta or an Athens situation as to who's going to win. Now, we will not be done by the end of June. This war is still going to drag on, but it will be very clear who's got the momentum and who is capable of striking the knockout blows in the long run. Another thing to watch for is just in the last few days, the Ukrainians have been launching some long-range drones several hundred miles into Russia. They will probably be able to get that into a degree of mass production by the time we get to May. And then we're talking about supply chain systems and logistical issues for the Russians, not just in Ukraine proper, but all the way back to the point of manufacture. So we will know in about 6 months just how this is going to unfold in the long term.
I see. And the next thought on my mind is one from another of your videos on Russia. And I swear, Peter, you left me with a distinct impression at the end of that video. You talked about the 1930s, and there was this other little thing that happened after the 1930s that was kind of a big deal. And that one had a 2 after it. There was a 1 after the one before that. Is there going to be a 3, a World War III? Is that what you were implying?
You're going to have to remember remind me which video this was.
Okay, so this was about the Russian price caps, I think it was, and you got to the end of it, and you said, dynamics similar to the 1930s in trade and energy.
Right. So,
and I was like, 1930s?
Yeah, one of the great things about globalization is by having a single military superpower, the entire world was combined into a single economic zone. And the efficiencies and the economies of scale that we got from that are something that we've never had before in human history. So if you want to make this an American example, imagine what your economy would be like in your local state if you couldn't trade with the other 49 states. So Texas has all the energy that it needs, but it's not going to have the iron ore. Minnesota is going to have the iron ore, but it's not going to have electricity. Iowa is going to have the corn and the pigs, but it's not going to have access to a road network or a rail network. Now, play that across the entire planet. We've had a single unified economic space, more or less. And in the case of energy, that means that energy that is produced in Saudi Arabia can go anywhere in the world, or the Germans can import energy from anywhere in the world. And as long as we've been locked together in this single system, everyone has a vested interest in making sure there are no disruptions to the transport system. Because if you have an interruption, say, in the Strait of Malacca, people in Vancouver are going to feel the energy pressure from that. What the price cap that the Europeans are putting on the Russians is doing is hiving the Russians off from the global pricing and energy security system, and then breaking the Russian system into 2 pieces, one that trades west into the European space and one that trades east into the Asian space. Well, if that's the case, then countries are able to choose what they want, but they're going to become locked into some of those choices. So China's probably the best example here. They're going to have a very heavy exposure to that Asian flow, which means that other countries have a vested interest, or let me rephrase that. Other countries no longer are going to be upset if something happens to that flow because it doesn't influence them. It's not part of their economies of a scale. It's a sequestered energy source on a very focused transport route going to a sequestered energy consumer. And if any part of that process breaks, it doesn't affect Ecuador. The last time...
Asian flow...
go ahead.
I was just going to clarify. Asian flow, this was the one I think you were describing. It's called like ESPO or something. It's
yes, the Eastern Siberian Pacific pipe.
Right. Gotcha.
Well, the last time this happened, where we had pricing and security relationships for energy flows separated, countries had a vested interest in interrupting the supplies of their rivals. And that was one of the many factors that led to the world wars. Now, I don't think we're going to see a World War III because no one has the capacity to operate in different theaters except for the United States, and we don't have the interest. But we can still easily have the economic outcomes of a major conflict in a series of regional fights as countries are discovering that they're going to have to take matters into their own hands in terms of their security and economic wherewithal. And in a world where demographics have already collapsed and the Americans have kind of checked out in terms of patrolling the seas, that means a lot of countries have a very long way to fall.
Well, has this begun? Are we, as many have said, effectively at war in Ukraine? The U.S.
Oh, no. If we were at war, the Russians wouldn't have power right now. So, no. We are certainly involved. There are no American boots on the grounds in any sort of combat operation. This is not something like we were doing in the Iraq War, where we had special forces enmeshed with the Peshmerga, helping with the technologies. Almost all the weapons assistance is being done virtually. Thank God for Starlink. So we definitely have our fingers in the pot, but just the fingers, no boots on the ground, and that makes a really big difference. If the United States was treating this like a real war and our military assets were activated, there would not be a single Russian vessel that was not on the seabed already, and every Russian economic and military asset within 500 miles of any coastline would already be in ruins. So anyone who thinks that, the United States is all in on this has not been paying attention to U.S. military capability. We might suck at nation building, but if it comes to turning things into craters, we are very good at that.
We're good at dropping bombs on things. So let's see. Let's maybe step back a little bit. I feel like we started to talk about who is really good at doing business in this broken up, deglobalized environment. I mean, I know I feel really happy that I was lucky enough to be born in the United States. I mean, I got lucky twice, right? I got lucky at globalization. I benefited from that. And now the world breaks up and hey, it's still the United States. Where else? Are you saying like any developed country? I mean, what about Japan? Japan's an island, right? I mean,
I anticipate we're going to be seeing sort of an American friends and family program evolving. NAFTA is obviously the core of that, and the hard work for that is not only done, but one of the great achievements of the Trump administration, from my point of view, from a cultural point of view, is convincing the hard right that tends to be very anti-migrant that Mexico is part of the family. I think that is the most indelible long-term impact of the Trump administration that we should be happy about. Other countries are going to be invited or already have found a way in the door. So the Australians and the Colombians already have long-term trade deals with the United States that are only going to get stronger. And Japan is a country that realized what was going on, realized that the Americans were backing away from sponsoring the global economy, realized the American military was going to be less adventurous in the future. And they looked around and they realized that they have the world's oldest demographic structure already. They've been dealing with this for 30 years. And they really didn't want to be facing the Russians in Asia and the Chinese by themselves. So they went to the White House and basically sought terms, and Trump's terms were humiliating, to put it in a single word. They signed anyway. And then when Biden came in, the Japanese made it very clear they did not want to amend the terms. So the Japanese have successfully bought their way into the American inner circle. So they're going to come along for the ride. Whether or not the Brits join is up to them. They have to really figure out what Brexit means. I mean, it's been 6 years. It should be time already, but they're just not there yet.
Right. So let's go there. I felt like when you were describing, population crashes, I was like, oh, so we're headed for Europe in the United States then. essentially.
The Europeans have a lot less wiggle room on their demographics because they have a lot less land area per unit of population. They just have not been able to maintain a high birth rate because they don't have something that we would consider the suburbs. You pretty much have a relatively dense urban core, and then you've got the farms, and there's very little buffer zone in between where an up-and-coming family can raise kids and have a yard. And if everyone's living in a condo, your birth rate's going to be lower. Also, they started industrializing decades before the rest of the world. So they're just so much further along in this process. And a lot of what we would consider your traditional Western European countries, Italy, Germany, Belgium, their demographics turned terminal back in the 80s. There just weren't enough kids to carry it forward. Well, and if you fast forward that 40 years, it means that they're literally running out of 40-year-olds. So this is the decade that all of those countries age into mass obsolescence. And we really don't have an economic model that can allow national cohesion. And then there's another crop of European countries, the bulk of the Central Europeans, all the way from Estonia to Bulgaria, that actually have faster aging demographies, but from a slightly younger base, and they will follow in the decade to come. We're looking at a Europe in as soon as 2040 that is made up of really just Spain, the United Kingdom, France, and the Scandinavian countries. The rest of it will have aged into desolation.
All right. So, there's a funny thing, like, as a financial analyst, when people have made all these like demographic arguments at various times, I'm not saying they're not good arguments, but they tend to use it it's like a marketing pitch. And I've done very well ignoring them, is what I'm saying. But it sounds like you're telling me, when it comes to geopolitics, like, demography is destiny.
It certainly limits your options. I'd argue that the way you see it is probably broadly accurate. In the United States, when we talk about demography, we usually do mean it as a marketing scheme. That you've got a number of people who are in this specific demographic group. They value these things. They're at this stage of their life. Therefore, these products make sense to them. And the group that we've constantly been talking about are the millennials and especially the baby boomers. But there's more to it than just what it means from a market point of view in the short term, because if you to play the long term, the problem with demographics is that they're glacial. It takes a lifetime for someone to live a life. And we've known since the 60s that the baby boomers eventually were going to age into retirement, and that was going to change the system because instead of paying taxes, they're going to be drawing pensions. Well, on average, that happens in the fourth quarter of calendar year 2022. We're here. We've known this has been coming for 40 years, but no one's ready because it was always off in the future. Well, the baby boomers are not just an American population block. They exist in every advanced country. The difference between the American boomers and everyone else is that American boomers actually had children that we now know as the millennials. Now, we can talk trash about the millennials all day, and I really do enjoy doing that. But they've got something going for them that all of their cohorts around the world don't. They exist. And so we have a 10 to 20 year period of financial crunch as the boomer money goes away before the millennials are in their 50s and providing capital. And we've got that's like a 10-year break in the financial world. And we've got a 20-year break while we're waiting for the millennials' kids to grow up. But if you look at the demographic structure of, say, Germany or Italy or Korea, they've got more people in their 60s than their 50s than their 40s than their 30s than their 20s than their teens than children. There's no coming back from this. So we are literally living in the last handful of years for a number of major ethnicities and economies that have been globally significant for decades, if not centuries. And it all ends in the first half of this century, with most of it being front-loaded this decade.
Right. And just to clarify what you just told me, more people in their 60s than in their 50s, more in their 50s than in their 40s, and so on down the decades in those areas?
Wow. All the way down to infants.
And you say the millennials exist. Again, just to clarify, we have a meaningfully large millennial cohort in the United States. And just to be clear, nobody else in the world does?
I wouldn't say nobody. The French do, the Swedes do, and the New Zealanders do. And that's it. So, the French can do the catering, and the Kiwis can man the bar, and the Swedes can be the bouncers, but a global economy, that is not.
No. And let's see, French, Swede, and Kiwis, are they going to wind up being part of the American Friends and Family Plan?
I think so. I mean, all in their own way. The Kiwis like to pretend that they're neutral, but when anything is really important, they're not. And with the Australians, their largest trading partner, joining us, they're probably going to come along, especially since their second largest trading partner, China, is going to implode. So I have no doubt that the Kiwis will be there, and I'm thrilled for that. The Swedes, now that neutrality is a thing of the past, they are practically being American when it comes to defense policy. So a Swedish-led Scandinavian bloc that works hand in glove with the Brits and the Americans, I think, is a foregone conclusion at this point. France will be France. They will always do their own thing. They will always have a sibling relationship with the United States, with all of the ups and downs that implies. But France is one of those rare countries that, while it might not be a global power, is stable, and they're not going to face a chronic challenge to their political or economic structures like most of the rest of the world will. In fact, there's a lot of upside potential if you're French right now, because they've kind of been trapped in this world for the last 30 years where the Germans have gotten more and more and more powerful versus France within the EU, to the point that the Germans are now making decisions for everyone with barely consulting the French. And from the French point of view, that is just sheer hell. And so the end of the European system from the French point of view is not nearly the unalloyed negative that the Germans would perceive it to be.
Right. So we've been talking a while here, but I need to get to a topic that maybe I haven't gone through your YouTube channel enough. I've seen several of the videos, and I want to mention to our listeners, check out the leadership series. Leave your politics at the door and check out Peter's leadership series. It's really good. I really like it. But the topic that I want to ask you about, it's not a topic, it's a continent that I don't think I've heard you mention. It's Africa. Whither Africa?
The future's not great. The story, let me back up. So sub-Saharan Africa in particular, it's built on a series of 5 stacked plateaus, and you hit over half a mile of elevation, usually within sight of the coast. So the difficulty of getting physical infrastructure from the coast, where there are no good natural ports, or very few, up to where the people actually live is very difficult. And then integrating these relatively highland zones with one another is very expensive. And you're dealing with mountains and tropics and desert or some combination thereof. And so it's the poorest part of the world because it's the most difficult part of the world to physically develop. Now, in the last 15 years, we've seen record growth. But unfortunately, that is not because of money things that have happened within Africa. As the baby boomers have been approaching retirement, but not gotten there yet, they've been the richest that they have ever been, and that surplus capital has spammed out into the world to enable people to borrow. Part of that is the story of Chinese growth. Part of that is the story of European growth. Part of that is the story of consumption within the African continent. Because the Africans, for the first time in their history, have been able to access nearly bottomless supplies of foreign capital at cheap rates. Unfortunately, most African states did not use that to build out infrastructure. They just spawned a consumption binge. And so Africa today looks a lot like Greece in 2005. And now that the baby boomers are retiring, and they're liquidating all their investments and going conservative because they can no longer adapt to a market crash, they have to go into cash and T-bills, all of that capital is going away. So the Africans will be left with the debt and without physical infrastructure. So they're going to have a very, very tough time. Now, there are pockets of Africa that can still function, or actually maybe even do better. There are 5 places where there's sufficient infrastructure from the coast to kind of metabolize what we consider to be a normal development structure. 2 of those, Nigeria and Senegal, actually have flat coastlines. And then 3 of them, Angola, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, have enough income from other things, oil in the case of in the case of Angola, and minerals in the case of South Africa, to actually overcome their geography to a degree to build physical infrastructure. And these parts still can interface with the wider world, but it's only those 5.
How much of a liability is, shall we say, political instability in Africa?
It doesn't help, but it goes hands in hand. If you don't have reliable economic growth, it's hard to have a politically stable environment, and the two definitely contribute to one another.
I'm sorry, you said 5. Nigeria, Senegal. It sounded like Kenya, Uganda was one.
Kenya, Uganda is a single corridor. Angola and South Africa.
Right. Angola and
South Africa.
And of course, South Africa. Good old South Africa. Wow. So let's take a minute here. We're getting towards the end, and I will ask you my final question soon, which is the identical question for every guest, no matter what the topic.
Okay.
But and in fact, maybe I'll just do that. Let's just do that.
Okay.
And see what we come up with. So I can't believe that you're even going to be able to do this with the amount of stuff that's in your head. You think about the entire world. But here's the question, Peter.
Shoot.
Do with it what you will. If you could leave our listener with a single thought today, what might that be?
How about I give you two, one bad, one good?
Okay.
Okay, let me give you the bad one first so we can end on a positive note.
Okay.
Between the Ukraine war and political mal-decision-making in China, we are seeing a massive shortage, global in scope, of every type of fertilizer production. Agriculture is the most vulnerable economic sector because if you don't have everything you need at every stage of the process, you lose an entire season and you have to wait for the next one. So this calendar year, we're going to be seeing fertilizer shortages throughout most of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Because these areas import on average 3/4 of what they need. That is going to be haunting us for years because it's unlikely to get better anytime soon because we're now seeing problems in finance and manufacturing and transport and the rest, all of which agriculture is dependent upon. Now, if you're a farmer outside of those zones, this is a golden opportunity. But that's my personal nightmare, is the implication of what happens when the agricultural input supply chain is strained and we're seeing it break. So there's my negative. The positive. We're looking at the simultaneous breakdown of the German and the Chinese manufacturing systems, and they're not coming back. In the United States, assuming for the moment that we want to have stuff, North America is going to have to double the size of its industrial plant in less than 5 years. That's wildly inflationary, and it's on top of the boomers gutting the labor force from their leaving, the millennials jumping up consumption because of their age bracket, Chinese labor going away, and Russian materials going away. So we're looking at 9 to 15% inflation in the United States for the next 5 years. This is a really good story because, yes, it's going to be high inflation, but doubling the size of the industrial plant, building that out using local workforces and shorter supply chains that use less energy and have less transport, and they're closer to the end consumer. They're using the most advanced technology that is available today, integrating Mexico. This is going to be the greatest growth story in the history of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And when it's done in a few years, we will be left with the world's most productive and stable manufacturing base, and it will largely be immune to international shocks. It's not a straight road, but wow, is it a good one?
Yeah, that's one of my big theses, right? It's basically reshoring is what I hear you saying.
Reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. There is not an industrial sector that has moved away from China in the last 4 years where the replacement system is less efficient than what it left. The Chinese have aged out. Their labor costs have gone up by a factor of 15 since the year 2000. They are not economically competitive in anything. And the only reason we still think of China as a manufacturing superpower is because of the admittedly large sunk cost of the investment to this point. But it's all going to be lost anyway, and it's almost all going to be lost in the next 3 years.
Okay, I know I said it was my last question, but you always make me think of more things, so I'm going to keep you for one more. What do you think of this idea of the Thucydides trap, then? It doesn't sound like you think it has much teeth to it, where two big superpowers, they're going to fight sooner or later. But China doesn't sound like the superpower everybody says.
Have you read the book? Because I don't want to put words in Graham Ellison's mouth. So he's perfectly willing, and he says so early in the book, that this happened in 60% of the power transfers in human history. That leaves 40% where it didn't happen. So there's a correlation, not a causation. And second, the challenging power, when it loses badly. So the Germans were the challenging power in the world wars. And that obviously didn't work out at all. So the Chinese have become wealthy because of globalization and because of the American security overwatch. If they were to challenge those things, they would have to have a replacement plan. They don't have the demographics to be consumption-led. They don't have the political system to be attractive to partners. They don't have a single ally, not even North Korea. And they don't have a navy that can reach more than 1,000 miles from home. So they would have to go through a top-to-bottom economic overhaul in order to survive the end of the American era. And that assumes that the Americans go quietly into that good night, which I don't see why that would happen because we have millennials.
All right. Well, look, if you don't get the hell away from your microphone, I'm going to keep you here all day. But I just want to say thank you for making time for us. I really appreciate it. I love your YouTube channel. What's it called?